He'd made a joke at her expense in German, confident she wouldn't catch a word of it. Until she answered back and knocked the smirk clean off his face. The aroma of freshly ground coffee beans curled through the air, weaving into the faint clink of cups and the soft rumble of morning conversation. It was one of those brisk mornings where time felt slippery, like it kept running just a step ahead of your hands, no matter how fast you moved. Behind the counter, Danielle Rhodes darted from table to table, her notepad smudged with quick scribbles. She carried a tray of cappuccinos in one hand, balanced like a seasoned pro, while topping off sugar jars with the other. She'd been clocked in since before sunrise. This was only her second shift of the week, and Tuesday had barely stretched its legs. At first, she didn't notice him. Most people wouldn't expect to see a billionaire parked in a little mom-and-pop café tucked between a strip mall pharmacy and a laundromat on 9th Street, downtown Phoenix. But Matthew Whitaker wasn't the type to go unnoticed. His charcoal gray suit looked like it had been steamed 10 minutes ago by a private valet. The Rolex on his wrist probably cost more than Danielle's aging Toyota, and the way he scanned the cafe told you he wasn't here for comfort or charm. He was waiting for someone. His assistant trailed in behind him, phone pressed to her ear, her clipped German rolling rapid-fire into the receiver. Matthew slid into a seat by the front window, where the desert sunlight spilled across the table like a stage light. He didn't order right away, just tapped something on his phone, leaned back, and waited with the kind of ease that came from knowing the world moved on his schedule. The cafe itself was nothing special by Phoenix standards. No neon signs screaming for attention, no sleek chrome or glossy leather booths like you'd find downtown near the banks. Just mismatched chairs, a long oak counter polished smooth by decades of elbows, and a chalkboard listing daily specials in looping chalk script. A couple of homemade pies cooled in the back, filling the air with a cinnamon sugar warmth that softened even the hard angles of morning rush hour. The regulars liked it this way. An elderly couple shared a blueberry muffin in the corner, their heads bent together over a crossword. Two college kids sat near the back, hammering away on laptops with headphones snug over their ears. A construction worker grabbed his black coffee to go, tipping his hard hat politely at Danielle, before heading back to the job site. Matthew didn't belong here, not because of his tailored clothes, though those stood out enough, but because of the way he carried himself. Every glance, every lean of his posture measured the worth of people and places, as if he was tallying up how much of his time they deserved. His presence had a sharpness to it, one that didn't sit quietly in a room. Danielle approached with her customer service smile, the one that hid how badly her legs ached. "Morning," she said, pen poised. "Can I get you something to drink while you wait?" Matthew flicked his eyes up briefly, then back to his phone. "Still water, room temperature bottled." It wasn't rude exactly, but the tone stripped away any hint of choice. It landed like an order barked in a boardroom. Danielle returned with his water a moment later, placing it carefully in front of him. His assistant slipped back into the booth then, her voice still hushed, but sharp, as she rattled off more German into her phone. Danielle couldn't quite piece it all together. Her ears weren't that quick anymore. But she understood enough. She'd lived in Berlin for 3 years, working part-time and finishing school, and though she'd let some of the sharper edges of fluency dull, plenty of it still came back, especially words you didn't forget. Words sharp enough to draw blood. The door chimed. A tall man in a navy suit walked in, silver threading his hair at the temples. He was pushing late 50s, maybe early 60s, and walked with the kind of confidence that made strangers step aside without realizing why. Matthew rose immediately, extending a hand, and in an instant, his English gave way to fluent German. They shook, sat, and leaned in close, but not close enough to keep their voices from carrying across a room built for clatter and chatter. Danielle wasn't listening, not on purpose, but sound carried in this cafe. And sometimes, words found their way to your ears, whether you wanted them or not. She caught a fragment about contracts, another about wire transfers, a name she didn't recognize, but knew mattered. She didn't try to fit the puzzle together, not yet. But then it came, the kind of comment that needed no translation. The older man chuckled, and Matthew let slip something in German about the waitress. His tone curled the word into something mocking, a joke that landed squarely on her. Danielle froze, pen hovering over her order pad. He thought the language was his shield, thought she was just another nameless face behind a counter who'd never catch it. But she had. She'd caught every word. Her stomach tightened, but instead of shrinking, she lifted her chin. She looked at Matthew Whitaker, really looked at him, and made a choice. She didn't say it yet, not right then. Timing mattered. But the truth was already on her side, coiled sharp in the back of her throat. And Matthew had no idea. She brought menus to their table, setting them down with her same practiced smile. "Are you ready to order?" Matthew didn't even glance her way. His focus stayed locked on the older man. "Just coffee. Black. Both of us." Danielle jotted it down, though she didn't need to. His tone told her cream and sugar weren't worth asking about. As she turned to walk away, another clipped sentence in German floated behind her. The older man chuckled again, the sound dry and easy. Danielle kept walking, the pot of fresh coffee warm in her hand, her mind already deciding how the next move would play out. Because sometimes the worst mistake a man like Matthew Whitaker could make wasn't underestimating his rivals. It was underestimating the waitress. The Tuesday sun had only begun to stretch across Phoenix when the bell above the cafe door gave its familiar jingle. Outside, the desert air shimmered faintly with heat already building, though it wasn't yet 9. Inside, the cafe felt like a small pocket of refuge, where mismatched tables and the smell of cinnamon made time slow to a gentler pace. Danielle Rhodes moved with quiet efficiency, her sneakers padding softly on the tile floor that had been scrubbed so many times, the patterns were beginning to fade. At 32, she carried herself with the poise of someone who had learned to smile through exhaustion, who could listen without hearing, and who understood that people often said more in their silences than in their words. She wore her brown hair pulled back, practical and neat, and her apron bore the faint shadow of a coffee stain that had resisted the wash. The cafe had opened at 6, and Danielle had been there long before that, helping Miguel fire up the grill, rolling silverware in napkins, and filling the air with the hiss of the espresso machine. The regulars came like clockwork. Mr. Bailey, retired mailman, who ordered oatmeal with raisins, and tipped $1 every day as if it were ritual. Mrs. Turner, sharp-eyed and kind, always asking about Danielle's brother before sipping her latte, and the young couple who came in hand, sharing a blueberry muffin over the crossword puzzle like teenagers, though they'd been married 40 years. It was an ordinary morning, the kind Danielle clung to. She had learned that when life offered peace, you took it without asking too many questions. But ordinary days have a way of breaking when least expected. The first sign was the silence that followed the bell. Most people who came in were greeted warmly by familiar faces, or carried the clatter of conversation with them. But the man who stepped inside carried stillness, the sort that bent the air. His shoes, polished black leather that had never touched dust, clicked sharply against the floor, echoing too loud in a place that thrived on gentle sounds. Spoons against mugs, the scrape of chairs, Miguel humming in the kitchen. He was tall, with dark hair combed back, his face set in the kind of calm that only money seemed to buy. His suit, charcoal gray, hung perfectly on his shoulders, its seams sharp as if they had been pressed moments before. On his wrist glinted a watch, whose worth Danielle didn't know, but instinctively measured against her car's engine light that had been glowing for months. The watch would win. Matthew Whitaker didn't look around to admire the chalkboard specials or the pie cooling on the counter. He didn't even glance at the regulars, who paused mid-sip, mid-bite, to take him in the way people do when something doesn't belong. He simply crossed to a window table where the sun caught the sheen of his cufflinks and laid a pale glow across the page of his phone screen. He sat, leaned back, and began typing with the deliberate speed of a man who had never been late to anything in his life. Danielle watched him from behind the counter, her smile slipping for just a second before she caught it again. She had seen men like him in Berlin, men who carried themselves like a transaction waiting to happen, measuring every word, every pause, every person, as if assigning them a dollar value. They were always polite enough on the surface, but polite could be sharp. Polite could cut. His assistant followed close behind, a woman in her 30s with sleek blonde hair, pulled into a tight knot, her phone already pressed to her ear. German spilled quickly from her lips, a cascade of clipped syllables, sharp and efficient. Danielle's heart gave a strange pull. She hadn't heard the language spoken like that in months, not since she'd left her apartment near Alexanderplatz and boarded the plane that brought her back to Arizona. For a moment, she could almost smell the roasted chestnuts sold by street vendors on Unter den Linden, hear the hollow clang of the U-Bahn doors shutting. But here it was again, not in Berlin, not in a lecture hall, but in a little café on 9th Street, where the strongest foreign accent usually came from Miguel rolling his R's in the kitchen. Matthew didn't order. He didn't even look up when Danielle approached with her pad and pen. He only glanced briefly at her, as if making sure she wasn't about to demand more than his attention could afford. "Good morning," Danielle said, voice steady, cheerful. "Can I get you something to drink while you wait?" "Still water," he said without hesitation. "Room temperature." "Bottled." The words were not cruel, but the tone, brisk and final, stripped away choice. It landed not as a request, but as an order. "Of course," Danielle said, masking her irritation with a smile she had perfected years ago. She brought him the water, within minutes, setting it down lightly so it wouldn't spill a drop. Matthew nodded once and returned to his phone. His assistant paced nearby, voice still low, but firm in German, throwing words Danielle recognized. Vertrag, Geld, Namen, contract, money, names, words with weight, words that didn't belong in this cafe any more than the billionaire in the corner booth. The regulars resumed their rhythm, but not without the occasional glance. People like Matthew Whitaker brought with them a ripple of curiosity. He wasn't a celebrity, not exactly, but in Phoenix word traveled. His investments, his developments, his sleek black sedans waiting at curbs, everyone knew something. Danielle tried to shake it off. She refilled Mrs. Turner's latte, took an order for pancakes from a young mother balancing a toddler on her hip, and carried out a plate of bacon and eggs to Mr. Bailey. But her eyes, almost against her will, kept flicking back to the man by the window. She noticed the way he scanned the room when his phone was quiet, not admiring the old wooden counter or the hand-painted mugs, but assessing, as though each person were a number on a ledger. His presence filled the space, not with warmth, but with the kind of gravity that pulled at everything around him. Danielle had worked long enough in customer service to know the signs. Some customers entered the cafe looking for connection, for the comfort of being known by name. Others came to hide, sinking into a booth with a newspaper or laptop, grateful for the anonymity of clinking cups and soft chatter. And then there were the rare few, like Matthew Whitaker, who didn't come to blend or to belong. They came to command, even in silence. What Danielle didn't know, what no one in the cafe could know, was how quickly this quiet morning would unravel. In the stillness of his presence, the hum of German syllables at his table, and the faint weight of arrogance in the air, a story had begun. One that would test the walls of the cafe and the strength of a woman who had already lived too many battles in silence. For now, Danielle kept moving. She wiped down tables, poured another round of steaming coffee, and greeted new arrivals with the smile she wore like armor. Yet beneath it, a current of awareness stirred. The billionaire at the window wasn't just another customer. He was a storm cloud gathering on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning. And though Danielle didn't yet know how fierce the storm would become, she knew one thing. When men like Matthew Whitaker walked into your life, ordinary mornings rarely stayed ordinary for long. The cafe door jingled again, a sound so familiar it almost disappeared into the background hum. But this time it carried weight. The man who entered was older, perhaps 58 or so, tall and broad-shouldered, his navy suit hanging on him with the kind of ease that comes from years of boardrooms and long lunches. His salt and pepper hair caught the sunlight, and his walk told everyone in the room something unspoken. He wasn't used to waiting, and he wasn't used to being ignored. Matthew Whitaker rose immediately, his phone slipping into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. His face shifted as smoothly as if a mask had been lowered, stern professionalism giving way to a tight but practiced smile. "Robert," he said, his voice lower, warmer now, but his words carried a rhythm that was unmistakably German. The two men clasped hands firmly, as though sealing an agreement before any word of business had been spoken. They sat across from each other, leaning in just slightly, and the air around them grew taut. From behind the counter, Danielle watched. She didn't want to, but it was hard not to notice how Matthew's presence expanded, with Robert Stanton seated across from him. If Matthew had seemed out of place before, now he looked like he was exactly where he belonged. Commanding a room, commanding attention, pulling gravity toward himself. Danielle carried 2 menus to their table. "Morning, gentlemen. Can I get you started with something to drink?" Matthew barely glanced up, his tone cool but decisive. "Still water for him as well. Bottled, room temperature. 2 black coffees." Robert Stanton, however, gave her a polite nod. "Thank you," he said in careful English, his voice softer, almost apologetic in contrast. Danielle smiled, jotted it down, even though she didn't need to, and walked back toward the counter. She wasn't offended by Matthew's clipped tone, at least not yet. She had dealt with worse. But there was something in the way his eyes flicked past her, as though she weren't a person, just another task on a long checklist that pressed on an old nerve. As she poured the coffees into sturdy white mugs, her ears caught pieces of their conversation. German again, fluent, rapid, businesslike, words layered on words like bricks. She didn't catch everything. Her ears hadn't been sharpened by the daily grind of Berlin in years. But she caught enough. Vertrag, Geld, Namen, contract, money, names. She returned to their table with the coffees, setting them down with practiced precision. Robert thanked her again. Matthew gave a curt nod, already back in German. She stepped away but lingered nearby, wiping down a table, rearranging the sugar jars. Anything that gave her reason to stay within earshot without appearing obvious. The longer she listened, the more pieces fit together. There were discussions of transfers, accounts, and arrangements. Danielle didn't understand the full scope of it, but she knew enough to realize it wasn't idle chatter. These weren't 2 men discussing sports scores or old times. This was business, the kind of business that didn't belong in a small café with chalkboard specials and pies cooling in the kitchen. And then, just when she thought she might tune it out, it came. The shift. Matthew's voice dropped, and his eyes flicked briefly in her direction. He said something sharp, clipped, with a chuckle that followed, a laugh that carried no warmth. Danielle froze, rag in hand, her pen still tucked in the pocket of her apron. The words rolled in German, too smooth, too quick, but she caught them perfectly. They weren't about business, they were about her. The insult wasn't about the coffee, or her service, or the café. It was about her appearance, the way she carried herself. Something he thought would never reach her ears. Robert gave a small laugh, awkward, the kind people give when they're not sure whether to agree or diffuse. But Matthew smirked, as if he'd made a clever observation, as if mocking a waitress in a language he thought was safe was some private sport. Danielle's chest tightened. She had been mocked before, on the streets of Berlin, by strangers who saw her as foreign, by professors who thought her accent marked her as less intelligent. But this was different. This wasn't ignorance. This was arrogance, the belief that words spoken in German would vanish into the air, unheard, unchallenged. Her German was not just conversational. It was fluent, precise, shaped by late nights at Humboldt University, by research papers written under flickering desk lamps, by heated debates in classrooms where every word mattered. She had lived in a city that demanded she learn fast, listen harder, and speak with confidence. Matthew Whitaker had no idea. Danielle's fingers curled tighter around the rag. She wanted in that moment to spin on her heel, to deliver the sharp reply already burning at the back of her throat. But she didn't. Not yet. Timing mattered. She had learned that lesson in Berlin, too. The value of patience, the power of waiting until the moment when words would land with the most weight. She straightened, smoothed her apron, and moved back toward the counter. Miguel caught her eye from the kitchen doorway. He tilted his head, curious. He had seen the flicker in her expression, the tightness in her jaw. Danielle shook her head faintly, signaling she had it handled. At the table, Matthew leaned forward, his words tumbling faster now. Danielle caught fragments. Sums in the hundreds of thousands, company names she didn't recognize, phrases that painted pictures of deals and power. His tone sharpened, then softened, but always with that thread of superiority. And then, another remark, Low but not low enough, again about her. She should just be grateful to have a job at all. The words pricked at Danielle like nettles under the skin. Her hand tightened around a sugar jar she had been refilling. She didn't flinch, didn't whirl around. But inside, her mind burned. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, and built too much of herself to be reduced to nothing in the space of one sentence. And then, as though the knife needed twisting, Matthew's voice carried again. You can tell she's not educated. Danielle's breath caught in her throat. Not because it was true, but because it was so confidently wrong. She had a master's degree. She had presented papers in lecture halls, where English was the minority language. She had built her confidence word by word in a city that demanded excellence. And here she was, dismissed by a man who had never asked, never cared, never looked beyond the apron tied at her waist. She turned slowly, setting the sugar jar back on the counter with deliberate care. The glass clinked softly against the wood, steady, controlled. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. Miguel stepped farther into the doorway, wiping his hands on a towel, eyes narrowing. He knew her well enough to recognize the storm brewing behind her calm. Danielle gave him the faintest shake of her head again. Matthew leaned back now, one arm draped casually over the backrest of his chair, as though the café itself belonged to him. He spoke another sentence in German, smooth but careless. There's no one here who would understand this anyway. Danielle's eyes closed briefly, her lips pressing together. There it was, the shield he believed he carried, language. The false safety of syllables he thought no one else could touch. But she could, and she would. Not yet, not now. She would wait until the timing cut the deepest, until he felt safest, until the fall from arrogance to humiliation would leave the sharpest mark. She smoothed her apron, her hands steady now, and turned back to the counter. She poured another coffee for Mrs. Turner, slid a plate of pancakes to the young mother with the toddler, and carried herself as though nothing at all had shifted. But inside, she knew everything had. This was no longer just a morning shift, no longer just a routine Tuesday. This was a test, a collision between arrogance and dignity, between a man who thought language was a fortress and a woman who knew it was anything but. And when the time came, Danielle Rhodes would remind Matthew Whitaker that words have power, especially when spoken by the one person you thought could never hear them. The bell over the cafe door jingled again, barely audible over the soft hum of morning chatter and the gentle clink of spoons against mugs. Another regular Mrs. Turner stepped in to pick up her latte, smiling at Danielle with the familiarity that came from years of exchanging pleasantries. Danielle returned the smile, her gaze flicking briefly toward the table by the window. Matthew Whitaker and Robert Stanton were deep in conversation, their voices low but no longer guarded. The language barrier, which had served as their shield, had already been breached. Now, as the conversation swirled around her in a familiar rhythm, Danielle's mind sharpened like a blade. She could feel it in the air, the shift in dynamics. What had started as a passing insult had quickly become something deeper. A layer of arrogance now hung between the two men, wrapping itself around their words, as if they didn't realize just how visible it had become. The volume of their conversation had softened, but the smugness hadn't. And she, in her uniform of faded jeans and a white apron, was standing right there, caught in the quiet storm of their dismissal. Mrs. Turner asked about her brother, as she always did, but Danielle only nodded and smiled as she handed the latte over, pretending to listen while she processed what she had just heard. Robert had been laughing at something Matthew said, his tone almost apologetic. It wasn't as though the comment had hurt her feelings, not exactly. It was the audacity of it, the unearned superiority in the tone. Danielle's fingers tightened around the handle of the coffee pot, her knuckles pressing against the smooth surface as she poured. There was a coldness to the way Matthew had spoken to her, without ever looking up, as though she were just part of the scenery, an invisible fixture in his day. The sting of his comment echoed in her mind. You can tell she's not educated. The words sat on her chest like a weight. It wasn't the first time she'd heard such things. She had learned to ignore the careless judgment of others, especially when they dismissed her based on her job. But Matthew Whitaker hadn't just dismissed her. He had reduced her, shrunk her down into something less than human, less than anyone who deserved respect. The coffee pot clicked into place, and Danielle wiped down the counter absently, her eyes darting back toward their table. She had to focus, to stay composed, to do her job. But this wasn't just another comment to brush off. This wasn't a passing insult. This was something different. It was personal. It was about her, her education, her value, and the silent assumption that she had no right to belong in a world where men like Matthew Whitaker existed. Her mind raced. How many times had she heard these judgments in one form or another? You don't belong here. You're not important enough to be heard. Your job defines who you are. But that wasn't the full story, was it? She had worked for everything she had. She wasn't just the waitress at this café. She was someone who had navigated life's hardships, from Berlin classrooms to Phoenix Street corners. And yet here he was, sitting in the sun, passing judgment, thinking his words couldn't reach her. His voice dropped again, but this time the words were clear. A full sentence, spoken just loud enough for her to catch every syllable. She looks like she should just be grateful to have a job at all. Danielle didn't flinch, but inside, her chest tightened, her stomach coiling like a knot that refused to let go. She wasn't sure if she could have stopped the flood of anger that started to rise, but she knew one thing. She wouldn't let him win. She wouldn't let him think for a second that he could get away with treating her as less. She set the rag down on the counter carefully, then walked back toward their table, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the weight of what she had just heard. It wasn't just a remark. It was an evaluation, a casual dissection of her worth, based on nothing but a few fleeting moments in the café. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and she caught sight of Robert's uneasy glance. He knew. He didn't fully understand what Matthew had said, not in the way she did, but he felt the shift too. The power play was so clear, so one-sided. It was like a silent game where one man believed he could dictate all the rules, while the other had no say. But Danielle wasn't just anyone. She wasn't the invisible woman behind the counter, not anymore. Not when he had made the mistake of underestimating her. She took a deep breath and moved toward the table. As she passed by, she dropped the menus in front of them, the same way she had done 100 times before, with no expectation of anything more than a polite exchange. But this time, she stood just a little bit closer, close enough to hear the business terms floating between them, close enough to catch a word here and there, enough to see behind the curtain of their smugness. She waited for the right moment. Matthew barely glanced up when she set the menus down, his eyes still glued to the phone in his hand. Robert smiled at her, polite as ever, but it was clear he was uncomfortable with the shift in energy. Danielle could feel the change too. Something in the air was different now. It wasn't just about the coffee or the omelet or the breakfast burrito that would soon arrive. It was about the way they were treating her. Matthew didn't speak directly to her. He just gave a faint, dismissive wave of the hand, as if to say, "You've done your part. Now leave us to our important business." But she didn't move. She stood there, taking it all in. The way he dismissed her without looking, without even acknowledging her presence beyond the cup of water he'd ordered. The way he spoke to Robert like a king holding court, making decisions with the flick of a wrist. Danielle smiled. "Everything good here?" she asked, her voice calm, almost warm, the words rolling out without a hint of bitterness. She had learned the art of keeping her tone steady, even when the words beneath were sharp enough to cut. Matthew didn't answer. He didn't even look at her. His eyes were still glued to the phone, tapping with deliberate indifference. "Fine," he muttered, like a mere formality. Then he spoke to Robert again in German, low but fast. Danielle heard it. She heard every word, every sneer hidden in the language he thought was his shield. Zumindest ist sie wenigstens fleißig bei ihrer Arbeit. Translation: at least she's doing her job. The word stung more than anything else. It wasn't just about being a waitress. It was about everything he had just assumed about her, the way he thought he could define her by a uniform and a paycheck. Her smile didn't waver, though it tightened just a fraction. She stepped back, taking a moment to steady herself. The clink of the sugar jar against the counter seemed louder now, the sound hanging in the air like a heavy note. She felt the tension shift again, a quiet energy rising around her. The other patrons, absorbed in their own quiet routines, were unaware of the battle that was quietly unfolding at the corner table. Matthew's companion, Robert, shifted uneasily in his seat, sensing the change. The power dynamic at the table was no longer as one-sided as it had seemed. The invisible shift had already begun. Danielle didn't rush to react. She could have answered right then, thrown the words back at him in flawless German, but she knew better. She had learned when to wait, when to let the silence speak louder than anything else. And in that silence, Matthew Whitaker was already beginning to realize he had made a fatal miscalculation. The game had changed, and he didn't even know it yet. The silence between the tables felt heavier now, laden with something more than the usual soft hum of morning chatter. It was a weight that pressed down on the café, like a storm cloud gathering in the distance. Yet everyone continued their routines, unaware of what was happening in the corner booth. The clink of cups and the faint murmur of conversations seemed distant, as though the air had thickened around Matthew Whitaker and Robert Stanton. Danielle kept herself busy, moving from one task to another, giving the café her usual calm, steady attention. But every step, every movement, seemed drawn out now, as if the space between the counter and their table had somehow stretched farther. She could feel the edges of her patience wearing thin, her calm demeanor a practiced mask. One she'd had to perfect over years of working with customers who expected nothing more than politeness in return for their disposable change. She had learned to listen before speaking, to wait for the right moment, to choose her battles, to let things simmer until the time was right for action. But Matthew Whitaker, with his polished suit and his crisp words in a language she knew all too well, had underestimated her, and now the tension in the air was like a taut string pulled just before it snapped. Matthew's phone buzzed again, the vibration almost too loud in the quiet space. He glanced at it, then back at Robert, his expression briefly clouded with the frustration of interrupted business. Danielle didn't move. She let her presence linger at the periphery of their world, the smell of fresh coffee, the murmur of the espresso machine, the rustling of papers at the nearby table. She was still just the waitress, just the woman who served coffee and refilled sugar jars. But something had shifted, and she wasn't going to ignore it any longer. Matthew picked up his cup, his fingers lightly tapping the edge of the mug as if the conversation wasn't moving fast enough to suit him. His voice was low but clear when he spoke again, his words spilling easily from his lips in German, not bothering to hide them this time. The tone in his voice was deliberate, calculated, like someone who believed they were in control, confident that no one in this café could possibly understand the significance of the words coming out of his mouth. Es ist schon fast witzig, wie sie sich hier fühlt, als wäre sie etwas Besonderes, he said, the laughter in his voice as thin as it was cold. Translation: It's almost funny how she feels like she's something special here. Danielle's fingers froze on the sugar jar she was adjusting. It wasn't the first time someone had underestimated her, but it was the first time she had let it go this far. She could feel the burn of indignation in her chest, but she swallowed it, keeping her face neutral. In the years she'd spent in Berlin and across Europe, she'd learned that people like Matthew often underestimated the power of those who could see through their facade. He thought he was safe. He thought he could hide behind his wealth and his foreign language, as though it was a shield that no one could penetrate. Robert, his face now more guarded than before, shifted in his seat. It was clear he wasn't as comfortable with the conversation anymore, and he cast a glance at Danielle before quickly looking away, unsure of how to handle the situation. Matthew, however, was too far gone in his arrogance to notice. His attention was fixed on Robert now, the business at hand more important than the woman standing at the counter. But he couldn't resist. The superiority in his voice crept back in, and his next words cut even deeper. Jeder hier würde ihr wahrscheinlich nicht einmal die Zeit geben, sich zu entschuldigen, wenn sie uns einen schlechten Service bieten würde, he muttered under his breath, almost as if speaking to himself. Translation: Anyone here would probably not even give her the time of day to apologize if she gave us bad service. The words stung, but it wasn't the sting that bothered her. It was the ease with which they came out, as if she were invisible, a mere afterthought in his day. He didn't even think for a second that she might hear, that she might understand. But Danielle understood every word, and it was that very assumption that infuriated her. The fact that he thought his dismissive attitude was beyond challenge, beyond reach. She wasn't invisible. Her grip tightened on the rag in her hand, her pulse quickening for a moment, but she forced herself to breathe. She couldn't let him see how deeply his words affected her. Not yet. The timing had to be perfect. She continued to wipe down the counter, her hands steady despite the anger burning beneath her skin. She could hear the soft chuckle that escaped Robert's lips, a nervous laugh that sounded more like an apology than an agreement. He wasn't fully complicit in Matthew's cruelty, but he was too reluctant to speak up. Matthew was speaking again, his voice louder now, as though he felt the need to fill the air with his dominance, to ensure everyone in the room knew he was in charge. But Danielle wasn't listening to him the way he thought. She was listening, yes, but not as he intended. Botsch, ich meine, warum würde sie auch nicht auf uns hören? Sie ist ein kleines Rädchen im System, nichts weiter. He added, almost with a shrug, as if this were just a simple fact of life. Translation: I mean, why would she listen to us? She's just a cog in the system, nothing more. That was the last straw. The final remark, the one that decided it for her. Danielle turned slowly, her face still a mask of politeness, and walked toward their table. She didn't rush. She didn't speed up. She moved with the calm of someone who had spent years learning how to read people, how to observe and wait for the moment when they least expected it. She reached the table, standing just slightly to their side. Matthew and Robert didn't notice her at first. Matthew was too caught up in his own words, and Robert had already shifted his attention back to the business at hand, distracted by the figures and names in front of him. But the moment had arrived. "Gentlemen," Danielle said, her voice clear and steady, though it held an edge of something they hadn't yet noticed. She didn't wait for them to look at her. She continued speaking, her gaze on the table in front of them, the menu they hadn't even bothered to glance at. "It's interesting that you speak so freely about me in a language you think no one here understands." Matthew's eyes snapped up, and for the first time, a flicker of surprise crossed his face. He didn't have to ask what she meant. He knew. He knew immediately that the shield he thought he had was nothing more than a fragile illusion. Robert's face flushed slightly, his discomfort now fully evident. Danielle stood there, her posture relaxed, but her words sharp. "You think no one here understands you, but I heard every word, every insult, every bit of mockery you thought was safe. And I'm sure you thought you were untouchable, just another businessman with a language and a power that couldn't be questioned." Matthew opened his mouth to speak, but the words stalled in his throat. He couldn't quite process what was happening. This wasn't the scenario he had imagined. Danielle's calm confidence was a stark contrast to his own arrogance, and it was beginning to crack the polished image he had worked so hard to maintain. "But here's the thing," Danielle continued, her voice unwavering. "I'm not just a cog in your system. I'm not just a waitress you can dismiss because of what I wear or what I do for a living. You don't get to decide my worth. Not now. Not ever." She paused, letting the silence settle for a moment, the weight of her words hanging in the air between them. Matthew's jaw tightened, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. "Now," she said, finally looking at him, her eyes steady and clear. "I'll let you finish your coffee, but just know this. I've been listening, and you've already said more than enough." The air in the café felt as though it had been drawn taut, stretched to its limits by the weight of Danielle's words. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, the clatter of plates, the hum of the espresso machine, all fading into the background. Danielle stood there, unwavering, her voice still echoing in the space between her and the two men at the table. Matthew Whitaker blinked, momentarily stunned, as if he had been caught in a trap he hadn't seen coming. His face, usually so polished, now betrayed a flicker of discomfort, a crack in his carefully curated facade. His fingers tightened around his coffee mug, the warmth from the dark liquid doing little to calm the sudden tension building inside him. Robert Stanton, sitting across from him, shifted in his seat, his expression caught somewhere between unease and curiosity. It was clear now that even he, who had been complicit in the conversation, felt the weight of the situation shifting. He had been silent all this time, letting Matthew lead, and now it seemed he wasn't sure how to handle the truth that had just been laid bare before them. Danielle didn't break her gaze. She let the silence hang in the air like a heavy cloud, thick with expectation. The moments stretched long, dragging out the tension in ways only a room full of people who hadn't yet realized what was happening could truly appreciate. The regulars at the counter were still absorbed in their breakfasts, unaware of the storm brewing at the back of the café. Mrs. Turner's voice broke the quiet only briefly as she chatted amiably with Miguel about the weather. The students in the corner continued typing, their headphones blocking out the world around them. But all the while, the energy at the table by the window had shifted, drastically. Matthew was the first to recover, though it was clear he didn't know how to respond. The shock of hearing his own words thrown back at him, fluent, sharp, and unequivocally understood, was too much to process in an instant. For the first time since he'd walked into the cafe, he wasn't the one controlling the room, and it threw him off balance. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes darting briefly to the other patrons, before settling back on Danielle. The smile he forced onto his lips was thin, lacking its usual conviction. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize you spoke German," he said, trying to regain control of the conversation with an air of condescension that felt strained. Danielle held her ground. "You didn't bother to ask," she replied calmly, her voice steady, unwavering. "You didn't bother to look at me as anything other than someone who was too beneath you to understand." Matthew's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at Robert, almost as if seeking approval or guidance. Robert shifted uneasily in his seat, his hand nervously reaching for his coffee. It was clear that even he felt the sting of Danielle's words. It was then that Matthew made his move, a calculated attempt to regain control of the situation. He reached into his suit pocket, pulling out a sleek black card holder. His fingers moved with precision, flipping it open as if this was a well-practiced maneuver. He took his time, sliding out a crisp business card, its edges sharp and clean, as though it were some kind of final move in a game he thought was still in his favor. The gesture felt deliberate, an offering, an invitation, but it was also a statement. "I still control the situation," he seemed to say. This card, this opportunity, would be the closing of the conversation, the final word. He placed the card gently on the edge of the table nearest Danielle, as if offering it to her as some sort of consolation prize, a reward for playing along. "If you ever want to discuss a better opportunity, something more suited to your talents, feel free to call my assistant," he said smoothly, his voice a little too polished, a little too rehearsed. "I'm sure we can find something that fits you better." Danielle looked down at the card, her eyes scanning it quickly, then up at Matthew, her gaze sharp and unyielding. She could feel the weight of the card on the table, the final gesture of a man who believed his wealth, his status, his invulnerability were enough to close the deal. She didn't touch the card. Instead, she looked at him, her voice low but carrying through the tense silence. "Is this supposed to be an apology?" Matthew blinked, thrown off guard by the directness of her question. He had expected gratitude, an apology from her for daring to challenge him, perhaps even a sense of guilt for interrupting his day. But instead, he was met with something far stronger, an unwavering resolve. "It's an opportunity," he replied quickly, his tone softening ever so slightly. He was trying to pull back, trying to recover, but the words rang hollow. "Sometimes it's better to move forward, rather than dwell on misunderstandings." Danielle smiled, though it wasn't a smile of gratitude. It was the kind of smile that came from the realization that Matthew Whitaker had just shown his true colors. "You think you can insult someone, treat them like they're beneath you, and then make it disappear with a job offer," she said, her voice sharp now. "That's not moving forward, that's trying to bury it." Robert shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking between them, as though trying to gauge whether the situation was still salvageable. It was clear now that he realized the magnitude of what had happened. Matthew, for all his wealth and status, had been exposed, not just for his words, but for the casual cruelty he had assumed would go unnoticed. "Do you know why I came back from Berlin, Mr. Whitaker?" Danielle asked, her voice steady, but now carrying an edge of something personal, something that reached beyond the confines of the café. She stepped forward slightly, her body language confident and clear. "It wasn't because I couldn't make it there," she continued. "I had a job, a future, friends. But my younger brother got sick. He needed someone to take care of him. Someone who could help pay for treatments that insurance wouldn't cover." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Matthew's expression shifted again. This time, it wasn't just discomfort. It was the faintest trace of regret, as if the realization of what he had done had hit him all at once. Danielle didn't give him time to respond. She was on a roll now, the unmasking complete. She wasn't backing down. "I came back because family matters," she said, her voice unwavering. "I work double shifts here, not because I can't get anything better. I work here because it lets me be home when he needs me." She let the silence settle again, this time with a finality that cut through the room like a blade. "So, when you look at me and see someone you think should be grateful to have a job, you're missing everything that matters," she said, her gaze fixed on Matthew, who now seemed to shrink back ever so slightly in his seat. She straightened up, ready to leave the conversation where it belonged, in the past. She didn't need his approval, his offer, or his apology. All she needed was to stand tall, to remind him of what real strength looked like. She turned on her heel, walking away from their table with her head high. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, but Danielle didn't feel it anymore. She felt lighter, stronger, empowered. Behind her, Matthew Whitaker remained seated, his once confident posture now visibly deflated. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. The damage had already been done. The hum of conversation had barely resumed when Danielle turned back to the counter, her every step measured, calm, deliberate. She'd said her piece, and in that moment, she didn't need any more words to finish the job. It was done. Matthew Whitaker had not expected this. He had walked into the café, expecting nothing more than a quiet cup of coffee before some important meeting or deal. Maybe he had planned to linger for a few minutes, check his phone, make small talk. Perhaps he'd even looked forward to a fleeting moment of being unseen in a crowd, like so many people with too much money and too much power. He'd certainly never planned on being challenged by the very person he thought was too insignificant to be worth his attention. But now, he sat there at the table, his cup of coffee half finished, the steam rising in jagged little wisps that seemed to mock him. Robert Stanton had grown quieter beside him, his gaze drifting from his business partner to the cafe door, his discomfort clear. But Matthew wasn't looking at Robert. His eyes were locked on the same spot where Danielle had been standing moments before, though now she was behind the counter, pretending to be absorbed in her work. The silence between them hung thick, the quiet tension in the room pressing down like a weight on his chest. Matthew took a deep breath, his fingers curling around the coffee mug once again, but the warmth of the porcelain didn't seem to soothe him anymore. He felt the walls of the cafe pressing in around him. Too close now, the little tables and mismatched chairs feeling smaller with every passing second. For the first time since he'd walked in, he wasn't sure where to place his gaze. He couldn't meet Robert's eyes. He couldn't meet Danielle's eyes. He had underestimated her. In that brief, uncomfortable exchange, she had torn down his walls, exposed his arrogance, and shattered the sense of invulnerability that came with his wealth. The humiliation was sharp, more than he had anticipated. He hadn't expected her to call his bluff, to call him out in front of Robert, the other patrons, and, worst of all, herself. What had seemed like an easy victory in his mind had become a quiet defeat. He glanced at Robert, who was now watching him closely, his expression unreadable, but not entirely sympathetic. Matthew cleared his throat and tried to steady himself. The smooth, polished air he usually wore so effortlessly was nowhere to be found. He was left with only the discomfort of being vulnerable, and it gnawed at him. "You didn't need to do that," Robert said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to break through the thick tension. Matthew didn't answer right away. He just took another sip of his coffee, his mind racing. "I didn't think she understood," Matthew muttered, his voice low, almost as if speaking to himself. Robert raised an eyebrow. "You thought because she was a waitress." He started, then stopped himself, his voice tight with a hint of frustration. "She still understands you, Matthew. You should have known that." Matthew's hand gripped the mug tighter, the porcelain suddenly too cold against his skin. "I didn't think she'd—" His words faltered. He had no good excuse. He had spoken to her with contempt because, in his mind, she had been nothing but a service worker, invisible and unimportant. He had seen her only for what she could do for him in that moment. Nothing more. The arrogance that had once seemed so justified was crumbling now, piece by piece. He had underestimated her intelligence. her ability to understand not only the words, but the power of the words themselves. He had expected the usual, polite nods, maybe a small apology, and for her to quietly accept whatever hand he decided to offer. But instead, she had done the one thing he didn't think she could. She had stood up to him. And she had done it in a way that made him look not only arrogant, but small. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated, trying to regain control of the conversation. But he couldn't. He had underestimated her, and now he couldn't look away from the mess he had made. The fact that he was sitting here, trying to regain some semblance of composure in front of Robert, and worse, in front of himself, gnawed at him. The image of Danielle's unwavering gaze, her calm, steady voice, kept replaying in his mind. The moment when she had stood her ground and refused to be belittled. She had already won. And it wasn't just because she had spoken German. It was because she had done something Matthew hadn't expected anyone to do. She had made him aware of his own flaws in front of others, made him see how he had treated people, how he had disregarded the worth of others, simply because they didn't fit into his narrow view of the world. But the most painful realization for Matthew was that Danielle hadn't just called him out for his condescending words. She had shown him that there was no escape from the truth. Not this time. He exhaled slowly, setting his coffee mug down on the table, his fingers drumming lightly against the edge. His eyes flicked toward Danielle once more, but she was no longer looking at him. She had gone back to her work behind the counter, wiping down the counter with precision, her movements as calm and fluid as ever. She had already moved past him, past the comment, past everything that had happened. Matthew felt a knot twist in his stomach. She was right. She wasn't just a waitress. She wasn't just a cog in the system. She had more courage, more strength, and more dignity than he had given her credit for. "Maybe we should just leave," Robert said, finally breaking the silence that had settled between them. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic, but it was clear he wasn't interested in staying any longer. Matthew looked at his business partner, nodding slowly. It wasn't as though they had anything left to discuss here. His mind was too clouded, too off balance, to focus on the contract negotiations that had brought them to this café in the first place. The things that mattered to him before, money, power, influence, now seemed so distant, almost insignificant. He didn't feel in control anymore, not of the room, not of the situation, not even of himself. He stood up, his legs stiff, and Robert followed suit. For a moment, they both lingered at the table, unsure of how to leave, as though the act of walking out would somehow change the narrative that had just been written for them. Matthew reached into his coat pocket and fished out his wallet, pulling out a few bills to leave on the table. His fingers lingered on the cash, as if he were still trying to buy back some sense of dignity. But the truth was, he couldn't buy it. Not here. Not with her standing behind the counter. Not with the realization that the woman he had dismissed as beneath him had just made him feel smaller than he had ever felt in his life. "Enjoy the rest of your coffee, gentlemen," Danielle's voice rang out behind him, steady and sure. Matthew didn't respond. He couldn't. He could only nod stiffly, his mind still reeling from what had just happened. He and Robert walked toward the door, the bell above it jingling as they stepped out into the bright Phoenix morning, their footsteps echoing in the quiet space. And as they disappeared down the street, Danielle stood by the counter, her heart still steady, her hands still moving, but her mind already moving on. She had made her point. And for the first time in a long while, it felt like the world had just shifted. Danielle had never been the kind of person to rush into a confrontation. She had learned long ago that silence often carried more weight than words, that a pause in conversation could say more than a shouted rebuke. But as the morning passed, and the last of the customers trickled out, she could still feel the sharp sting of Matthew Whitaker's words, the ones he thought she couldn't hear, the ones he thought would slip through unnoticed. Now the café was quieter than it had been in hours, the rush of the morning crowd ebbing with the fading sunlight, the sound of the espresso machine whirring in the corner, the clink of dishes being stacked, and the soft shuffle of Danielle's feet against the worn floor tiles were the only noises left. She stood behind the counter, wiping down the surface for the third time, her hands moving methodically. Every so often, she caught herself glancing toward the corner table where Matthew and Robert had been sitting, where their conversation had spun out of control, and where she had made her stand. The lingering bitterness of their words still tugged at her, but she wasn't angry anymore. No, this was something else now, a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing she had held her ground. Still, there was something about the way Matthew had offered her that business card, the sleek black card with its sharp edges, the silver lettering that glinted under the soft café lights. It had been his way of trying to erase the past few moments, his way of saying, "Here, take this. Forget what happened. It's all just business." She had refused it, not because she didn't need it, not because it wouldn't have been an easy way out, but because she saw it for what it truly was, another attempt to diminish her, to offer her something he thought she'd want, a consolation for the words he had so carelessly thrown her way. But now, as the day stretched into its slower rhythm, as the final customers came and went, the weight of that card lingered in her mind. The unspoken words that had been left in its wake. Was it just a hollow offer? Or was there something more beneath the surface? A part of her wasn't sure, but she knew one thing. She couldn't leave it like this. She couldn't let him think that his little gesture would fix everything. Her hands paused on the counter, the rag held loosely between her fingers. The silence was now filled with the hum of her thoughts. It wasn't just about the insult anymore, it was about something deeper. Matthew had offered her that card in a way that suggested it would be enough, that it would make everything go away, that the power dynamic between them could simply be erased with a single piece of paper. But it wasn't. Not by a long shot. Her eyes lifted to the door, where the late afternoon light was starting to filter in, casting long shadows across the floor. She could still see the place where Matthew and Robert had been seated, and as she stared at the empty booth, a quiet determination settled in her chest. She wouldn't let him walk away from this. She wouldn't let him walk away thinking he could fix everything with a card. The door opened, and a familiar face entered. The regulars, Mrs. Turner, with her cheerful demeanor and warm smile. Danielle returned the greeting, but her mind was elsewhere. She saw the movement in the door, the faint outline of a black sedan that had just pulled up to the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the fading light. The sleek vehicle had been parked across the street just moments ago, but she hadn't thought much of it. Not until now. Her heart skipped a beat as the door swung open again, and this time it was Matthew Whitaker who walked in, his frame filling the doorway like a man who had come to make good on something left unsaid. His face was still tight, the usual smug expression gone, replaced with a faint sense of discomfort. He wasn't wearing that air of invincibility anymore, not the one that had followed him into the cafe earlier. Now he seemed almost human. Behind him, Robert Stanton trailed in, his face impassive, but a little more alert than before. They didn't speak to anyone else in the cafe, didn't stop to order or chat with the staff. They made their way straight to the counter, where Danielle stood, her hands still on the rag, but now hanging loosely by her side. Matthew cleared his throat, and for a brief moment Danielle thought he might say something he hadn't before, some form of apology, or at least an attempt to explain himself. But instead, his voice came out cold, businesslike, like someone who was trying to regain some of the control he had lost. "I don't think we properly finished our conversation," he said, his eyes fixed on hers, his words clipped, almost rehearsed. Danielle didn't answer immediately. She simply stared at him, watching the way his eyes darted toward the door, the way his posture was stiffer now than before. He had come back for something he felt was owed to him. A second chance, maybe. Or perhaps it was the realization that what he had given her earlier, the business card, wasn't enough to wash away the exchange. He had offered it, expecting her to accept it as a way to smooth things over. But that card, to Danielle, represented so much more than just a business opportunity. It was his attempt to erase what had happened. "I didn't mean to offend you," he said, his voice softer now, but there was still an undercurrent of something. An attempt at redemption, or perhaps at justification. He was still trying to play the game on his terms, still hoping that a few polite words would make everything better. Danielle took a slow breath, her gaze not leaving his. "I don't need your apology," she said, her voice steady, firm. "You think that card fixes anything? That it makes the words you said disappear?" She stepped forward slightly, her expression unreadable, though her eyes carried the weight of everything she had just endured. That card doesn't change the fact that you thought I couldn't hear you. It doesn't change the fact that you thought you could treat me like less. It doesn't change the fact that you don't know a thing about me." She paused, letting her words sink in. Robert shifted uncomfortably behind Matthew, but Danielle didn't break eye contact. "Now you want to offer me a job?" she asked, her voice calm, yet sharp as a knife. "Because that's what you think it takes to make this right? You think you can buy my silence, buy my acceptance?" She glanced briefly at the card that still sat on the counter, the edges gleaming mockingly in the light. "I'm not interested," she added, her voice lowering. "Not now, not ever." For a moment, Matthew said nothing. He just stood there, his expression hardening. The world outside the café seemed to disappear in the stillness, and in that moment, Danielle realized something that felt almost freeing. She wasn't the one on trial here. She wasn't the one who had to apologize. She was the one in control now. Finally, Matthew exhaled, the tension in his shoulders visibly relaxing. He didn't argue. He didn't try to change her mind. He just nodded slowly, as if accepting that there was no more room for negotiation. "I see," he said quietly, his tone no longer that of a man who thought he could command the room. "Well, I'll leave you to your work." He turned toward the door without another word, Robert following silently behind him. The bell above the door jingled again as they stepped outside into the Phoenix sun, the weight of their departure leaving the air in the café cooler than it had been. Danielle stood there for a moment, watching them go, and then slowly, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders, she allowed herself to breathe. She wasn't small anymore. She had never been small. And as the door swung closed behind them, she knew that this moment, this small victory, would stick with her for a long time. The morning sun had long since risen high above Phoenix, casting its golden light across the streets. The cafe was quieter now, the early rush gone, the last few customers slowly trickling out. Outside, the world hummed on, as it always did, but inside the small, unassuming space of the cafe, something had shifted, a quiet transformation that wasn't just about the day's events, but something deeper, something lasting. Danielle stood behind the counter, her hands steady, as she wiped down the counter one final time. She didn't need to look up to know that she had made her mark. Matthew Whitaker had come into her world with the kind of arrogance that only comes with wealth and power, assuming that his status would keep people in line, keep them from challenging him. But when he had underestimated her, when he had thought she wouldn't hear his dismissive words, it was his own arrogance that had betrayed him. She had taken control of that moment, and in doing so, she had shifted the balance. The card, the sleek, black card he had offered her in an attempt to sweep it all away, had been left on the counter, a symbol of everything he thought he could buy, control, or manipulate. She hadn't taken it, not because she didn't need the job, but because she understood that real power came from standing firm, from refusing to be diminished by anyone, no matter how much money they had. The door opened behind her, and she turned instinctively, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips, as Mrs. Turner walked in, clutching her usual crossword puzzle and latte. Danielle greeted her warmly, but her thoughts were still with Matthew Whitaker, still with the confrontation that had unfolded earlier. He was gone now, just another customer who had come and gone, his exit as quiet as his arrival. But in the space left behind, Danielle knew something had changed. The cafe, the people she interacted with every day, none of them would ever see her the same way again. And neither would she. As the day wore on, word of the encounter spread, slowly at first, and then more rapidly. It was the kind of story that naturally caught the attention of those who worked in the small local businesses around 9th Street. By mid-afternoon, a few of the regulars who had been present that morning began to chat about it. Mrs. Turner, ever the talker, had caught the gist of the exchange, and by the time she left, she had spread the story through half the block. Soon enough, Danielle was no longer just the waitress at the cafe. She was the woman who had stood up to the powerful billionaire, the one who had quietly but firmly shattered the notion that wealth and privilege could grant anyone the right to belittle others. She hadn't just won a personal victory. She had made a statement, one that reverberated far beyond the walls of the cafe. But it didn't end there. A few weeks later, the repercussions of that encounter took shape in ways Danielle hadn't anticipated. The news cycle had picked up the story, and while it hadn't become a media frenzy, it had caught the attention of a few journalists who were more than happy to share it. The viral spread of the story reached more eyes than Danielle could have imagined. Her act of defiance had become a symbol for something much larger than herself. It was a reminder that no one, no matter how powerful or wealthy, was above accountability. The narrative wasn't just about the confrontation with Matthew Whitaker. It was about the everyday struggles of people who were so often overlooked. It was about standing up for yourself when others tried to make you small. Then, about 2 months later, Danielle received a phone call that would forever change her life. The voice on the other end was smooth, polished, and unmistakably familiar. "Ms. Rhodes," the voice said, the tone polite, but with an air of urgency. "This is Megan Carter from Whitaker Industries. I represent Mr. Whitaker." Danielle's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this. After everything that had happened, she thought Matthew Whitaker had simply moved on. She had assumed he would go back to his world, to his business deals, and forget the waitress who had dared to challenge him. But this call, this interruption in her otherwise quiet life, was a reminder that the echoes of that morning had lingered longer than she'd realized. Megan's voice continued. "Mr. Whitaker has asked that I reach out to discuss the incident at your café. He understands it may have been misinterpreted, and he'd like to offer you a more formal position with the company." Danielle's stomach tightened, the weight of the conversation settling in. She listened intently as Megan went on, the words feeling as hollow as they had when he had offered her the card. This wasn't about reconciliation. This wasn't about apology. It was another offer to smooth things over, to buy her silence with promises of wealth and opportunity. But this time, Danielle didn't hesitate. "I'm not interested," she said firmly, her voice unwavering. She could practically hear Megan's surprise on the other end of the line, but Danielle wasn't finished. "I don't need an opportunity from Mr. Whitaker. I have everything I need right here." She didn't explain herself further. She didn't need to. The decision had been made long ago. "I'm sure Mr. Whitaker will understand," she added before hanging up the phone. The moment the call ended, Danielle felt a rush of relief, the kind that comes with knowing you've made the right decision, even when it's not the easy one. What followed was something unexpected, a flood of support. It came from the unlikeliest of places. Her regulars at the cafe, friends she had made over the years, even some of the local business owners who had heard the story. They had watched the way she had handled herself in the face of adversity, and they admired her for it. Word spread that Danielle was planning to open her own cafe, a place where she could build something on her own terms. No wealthy benefactors, no invisible lines drawn by power and money. Just her and the people who supported her. It wasn't just a business venture, it was a legacy. It was her way of saying that anyone could build something meaningful, no matter their starting point. As the months passed, the dream of her cafe took shape. Danielle worked long hours, scraping together resources, taking small risks, and building the kind of community she wanted. She named it The Grounded Bean, a nod to her roots, to the years she had spent working behind the counter, and to the humble nature of the life she had chosen. And the customers came. The regulars who had always known her as the waitress behind the counter now came to support her, to be a part of something larger than just a cup of coffee. They came because they believed in her and because they knew her story. It wasn't just about the coffee. It was about what the cafe represented: resilience, determination, and the courage to fight back against the forces that would try to diminish you. Matthew Whitaker never called again. His company moved on with its business, and Danielle moved on with her life. But what she had learned in the small cafe that morning had stayed with her, and it had shaped the woman she was becoming. And so, the legacy was born, not from a business card or a job offer, but from the strength of a woman who refused to be overlooked. She had learned that power didn't come from what you could buy. It came from standing tall, speaking your truth, and knowing that no one could ever define you except yourself. In the end, that was the greatest victory of all. What do you think about the way Danielle handled the confrontation with Matthew Whitaker? Do you believe that standing up for yourself, even when it seems daunting, can lead to greater opportunities and personal growth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear how you've dealt with similar situations, or how you think power dynamics like this play out in your own life. If you found this story inspiring and want to hear more about real-life moments of courage and strength, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We're all about providing content that challenges perceptions, encourages personal empowerment, and helps you grow in ways you never thought possible. By subscribing, you'll get access to more stories, tips, and deep dives into how ordinary people rise above adversity. We've got plenty of valuable content coming your way, and we want you to be a part of this journey. So, hit that bell icon to make sure you never miss out. Let's continue to inspire each other and build a community that stands strong, no matter the challenges.